We're very excited to have Unati Narang present this work on backwards compatibility. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature, and then the panelists feel free to interrupt at any time to ask questions. And anyone that wants to stick around at the end, feel free to do so, and we'll have a more loose discussion about the paper. All right, so why don't you get started, Unati?
Thank you so much, Andre, and thank you everybody for inviting me to share my research at the VQMS seminar today. I'm really excited to share this work with you. It's titled Going Backward to Move Forward, Backward Compatibility and the Sales of Previous and New Generation Video Games. And this is joint work with my co-author Venki, who is also here. And so I'm going to pass on all the tough questions to Venki. So let's begin. What are we trying to do in this project? The goal is to understand what happens when a company introduces backward compatibility that allows a new generation of hardware to play older generation software or accessories. And the idea here is to look at specifically in the context of video game industry, where Microsoft allowed Xbox One, the new console, to play games from the older console, which was Xbox 360. And so why are we looking at backward compatibility? This is a key strategic decision in many different high-tech industries, including cameras, mobile phones, video games. So for instance, in cameras, we may worry about compatibility of a new camera with lenses from an older camera, or for mobile phones, we may be concerned about a new model of a phone working with older operating systems. And in case of video games, as I will be talking about for the next hour, we may be worried about whether games from a previous generation of console would work with the new generation console. And in this paper, that's the empirical setting we will mostly focus on. Another reason why we may worry about compatibility is because it's a popular and very desirable feature among consumers. So if you look at the $45 billion gaming industry, we see a lot of consumers wanting this feature. In fact, when backward compatibility was first launched, we saw more than 50% Xbox owners using this feature, and within a year, over 280 million gameplay hours were recorded on these kinds of older games. So again, this is pretty important for consumers. However, what is not clear, and this is a particularly important point here, firms follow different kinds of approaches for backward compatibility. And this is because it's an expensive decision, and the strategic implications are often not clear. So there has been some work, there's a working paper which shows there is a potential cannibalization of the older generation hardware once backward compatibility is launched. And in practice, we see in this industry, Sony and Microsoft have had traditionally very different approaches. For Microsoft, backward compatibility was particularly important starting Xbox One. And for Sony, in fact, there's a controversial comment made by Jim Ryan, their CEO, who basically said it's not an important feature for us. So there is this kind of tension where firms are following different approaches, and it's not clear what their implications would be. And so there's work that's been done in this setting that looks at cross-compatibility across platforms. So whether PlayStation games would work on Xbox. However, we don't particularly know very clearly what would happen in case of backward compatibility, particularly what would happen to sales of the old and new video games. And this is really where the money lies in the industry, because companies make royalties off of game sales. So that's going to be our context and focus of this paper. Before I move forward, I want to step back, no pun intended. I want to explain how backward compatibility works. So here what I'm showing you is Xbox 360, which is the previous generation console launched by Microsoft. And it had its own set of previous generation console games, which I'm going to call PGC games going forward. Note if these same PGC games also worked with the new console Xbox One, then we would consider these games to be backward compatible. However, what happened in practice is only some of these PGC games were made compatible with the new console and others were not. So there is this variation, and we see because of this, two kinds of PGC games emerged. One set which is available and can run on the new console, Xbox One, We also have non-backward compatible games which do not run on Xbox One. So in this paper, we're going to focus on these PGC games. In addition, we're also going to focus on the new generation console games which were launched specifically for Xbox One, the new generation console. And the important thing here is that these games are not actually playable on the old console. And so our interest will be to capture what happens for both the PGC games once backward compatibility is launched, as well as these NGC games like I'm showing you, Batman here, which is a new game launched for the new console. Okay, so our three research questions or the objectives here are, what happens to the sales of PGC games once backward compatibility is introduced? So you may think on one hand, their demand may actually be boosted because now owners of the new console can play these games. On the other hand, there may be no change or even a decrease if a lot of consumers already own these games and they don't have to buy them again, or they may even continue buying the non-compatible games if they don't ever plan to upgrade to the new console. The second question is, what happens to the sales of NGC games once backwards compatibility is introduced? Now, these games do not themselves experience a change in compatibility. As I showed you, they're always going to be compatible with the new generation console. However, what we may see is more demand for them among gamers who upgrade to the new console after backward compatibility is launched, because maybe their existing inventory of games can be put to a better use. And we may also, on the flip side, see the new console upgraders buying more either of these games, or there may be a negative effect if those consumers continue playing their PGC games that are now available for the new console, and they may not care about the NGC games so much. Finally, we want to better understand the mechanisms based on game and buyer characteristics. Especially, we want to see if there are any differences for high versus low selling games, or are pre-owners of these existing PGC games potentially buying less of the PGC games because they already have them. And finally, based on a consumer's upgrade to the new console, do we see any differences? So in a sense, we are looking at some of those mediating reasons underlying these patterns. So I'm going to pause here for questions before I move into our related work and empirical setting to make sure if there are any clarification questions about how backward compatibility works, I can address them now. Okay, looks like we're good, so I will move on. I'm going to talk about, for the rest of this presentation, some related work in the video game and upgrade area. I will also then talk about our empirical strategy and some results. So let's talk about some of the related work. So there hasn't been a whole lot of work directly looking at backward compatibility, but our paper also relates to the broader literature on new product introduction and upgrades, where there is work that has shown consumers value the replacement cost or the upgrade cost when they're making a decision to change their hardware. There's also work within the video game industry, which has looked at interesting phenomena such as network externalities, both direct and indirect network effects, as well as modeling of product and market concentration in these industries, as well as any kind of intertemporal price discrimination. However, when it comes specifically to compatibility, there's only one paper on backward compatibility, which is a working paper. And there is some evidence they show of cannibalization of the older hardware. However, there is not too much work on game level variation in compatibility, especially backward compatibility. So that's going to be the focus of this paper. Our empirical setting.
Sorry, just a quick question. So now, like what's happened more recent, this is sort of like the older generation. What's starting to happen now is that like Xbox by default is going to allow compatibility permanently going forward, right? And I think PlayStation, it's like more of a model where you have a certain hardware and it will run better on the newer ones and worse on the previous ones. Could you comment on that in terms of how it relates to your research question?
That's absolutely true. So our research setting will be the 7th and 8th generation of console, where we're looking only till the Xbox One and PS4 launches. And like you're saying with Xbox Series X or PS5, a lot of the compatibility now is going forward more inbuilt in the hardware. But the generation of game consoles that I'm talking about, there will be still a lot of variation, and those industry standards haven't yet emerged. The other thing that you raised is the technology with FPS boosting technology. Now it's also a matter of how these old games play in terms of their quality or in terms of frames per second. Can we get better quality? And so that's been the more kind of norm in the current generation of hardware. Unfortunately, our data ends around 2018, so we don't capture those patterns in this research, but that's something super interesting we'd love to look at. Okay, thank you. So the setting is, like I was saying, in the 7th and 8th generation consoles, where our time period really is around 2013 to 18. And in 2015, backward compatibility was first launched by Microsoft's Xbox. And there are some important aspects I want to highlight in this setting, because this program is the focal event we're going to study. And so it's important to understand 3 key aspects. The first is, on a single day, Microsoft announced that 80 or more of its titles were going to be playable from the Xbox 360 console, now on the new Xbox One console. And they were both available for physical and digital versions. Second, there was no pre-announcement of which specific games were going to be made backwards compatible. There was a generic announcement in June of that year. And in one of our robustness checks, we do check for any kind of pre-announcement effects, but there was no way anybody could have preempted these are the specific set of games that will be launched in November. Finally, and really important question, which I'm sure a lot of you are already thinking about and probably thinking about asking, is who controls this decision? Who decides which games will be backward compatible? And so the decision was not fully controlled by Microsoft, because the game publishers played an important role. Microsoft had to enter into relicensing agreements with publishers, music producers, and so on for every game that was to be made backwards compatible. So many popular games like Call of Duty, which is Activision, the game publisher, they couldn't actually launch them to be backward compatible in this initial rollout for reasons related to the game publisher. So those are some important institutional factors about this setting and this program. In the new version of the paper, we will be posting it soon on SSRN, and we've looked at controller level compatibility as well. But for today, I'm going to focus on the main results for video games. Okay, I'll next describe our data, and then I'll pause for more questions if there's any clarification. So in terms of our data, we collect game level sales data from a retailer. This is a large-scale US retailer with over 4,000 stores and an e-commerce website. It includes digital and physical game sales. And we have monthly data for about 54 months, out of which 24 months are before backward compatibility and 30 months are after compatibility is launched. In addition, we use this data combined with game characteristics that we scrape from Moby Games as well as Metacritic to recover game characteristics. We find most of the games tend to be in the ESRB ratings of teenager or everyone audiences. We also have data on what genre these games are. Most of them tend to be action adventure games, followed by sports and other genres. And finally, we also collect data on user ratings to see how popular these games are among users, which is an average rating of 6.6 on 10. And finally, time between game release until the backward compatibility decision, because in this market, a lot of sales happen in the first few months of a new game launch. And we find that on average, a game in our data is 5 years old. Okay, what's also
sorry, quick question. Sorry, would there have been another production run for these games such that they would be available in terms of hard disk copies? I guess my concern is that you're not really seeing what Xbox sells directly to customers, right, using the Xbox store. So I'm wondering how much the retailers can approximate this.
Oh, I see what you mean. So you're saying, is there another production in terms of actual disk and restocking of those disks?
Yeah, would there be an availability for the previous generation game?
That's a great point. And there are, I guess, 2 factors here. So first of all, the gaming retailer itself is pretty huge with almost 10% market share. So for the discs that do exist, we would keep seeing their sales. The second thing is they're also trading in used games. So even if the actual new game kind of went out of stock at some point, we would still see some of them, the titles being traded at the retail store. And third, like you said, we do unfortunately don't observe direct sales from the Xbox store itself. So if there are buyers who are buying from the Xbox store, those would not be covered in these game sales. But since we're doing more of a relative comparison and we compare games with different PGC and non-PGC, so for that purpose, I think we have a good relative baseline from this retailer. But that's a very good question.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to talk about that with individual level data too. So what's unique about getting this data from a retail setting is that we can actually observe individual level shoppers and their entire purchase histories. So we do get a random sample of 29,000 buyers who bought any Xbox product in our data period. And we do find that for these, we can look at the exact transaction data, including their physical and digital game purchases. And we see that roughly 50% of them owned a backward compatible game before backward compatibility was ever launched. We also see that they tend to upgrade 33% of the time. And we see that their average interpurchase time is about 23 days. So we additionally are now trying to complement this data with Twitter level data from just to understand user sentiment and how consumers feel about backward compatibility in November of 2015. And we're in the process of using these data to better understand the mechanisms. Okay, so with this kind of a data, what is going to be our identification strategy? I'm going to get into that, but I want to see if there are any questions from the audience before.
Sorry, can I ask just a general question? Maybe this is something that you're going to get to about the types of games that were decided to become backward compatible. I mean, maybe based off the research questions, the project seems somewhat descriptive, so maybe it's fine. But obviously, there seems to be some element of selection. In particular, I'm curious about games that have some sense of like generation, like Pokemon had like red or blue, and then there was gold. These seems like exactly the kind of game titles which would have very specific incentives, either to allow or not allow backward compatibility. Can you speak to the kinds of games that were made compatible?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I will get into that in a little more detail when I talk about our identification. But in general, we saw a wide range of games from various different publishers, popular and unpopular, and we do compare them on their observed characteristics. So even my intuition going into this project was that we'll see more of the popular games or games that create nostalgia, like you said, Pokemon, because the idea Microsoft would want to preserve the art form of these games. But in practice, we actually don't see that. The set of games that were made backward compatible seem pretty comparable to those that were not across a bunch of different observed characteristics. And I think it goes back to my earlier point that a lot of times they had to enter into relicensing agreements. And so even some of the more popular or nostalgia evoking kind of games were not part of this initial rollout. Of course, if you look at it now almost 500 or 600 titles have become backward compatible over the years. And so that logic would make sense for sure. But that's a great question. Thank you. Okay, so empirical strategy and analysis. Again, this is not a paper where we're trying to create some kind of economic model of what goes into a consumer's decision to buy consoles and software. We are most interested in quantifying what happens when backward compatibility is launched. Given that, we're going to estimate a difference in differences regression. And if you've zoned out, this is the one slide I really want you to pay attention to, because I'm going to explain what our comparison points are going to be and how to interpret these estimates. So here I'm showing you an equation where Y is our outcome of interest at the game month level. For answering our first research question, which is about what happens to PGC games, the treatment group in this case will be all PGC games that were made backward compatible, but we are comparing them to those games that were not made backward compatible as part of this rollout of Microsoft's compatibility program. And so the second research question then, where we don't have this variation, remember all NGC games are working with the new controller, new console. So here, what variation do we exploit? Instead of looking at game level variation, we have to be a little bit more clever. So we use for each of the NGC game for Xbox One, we use the exact same game title for a competing console, which is PlayStation 4 of the same generation as our control group. And so any estimate we will have for the treat times post, the beta one here would represent what happens to the sales of NGC games for Xbox One relative to the exact same title for the PlayStation 4. And so just to give you a quick recap, here we are comparing the outcomes for PGC games, which are backward compatible, for instance, Borderlands, with those that are non-backward compatible before and after the launch of the compatibility. And in the second question, which is NGC games, we now look at the exact same title. So Batman Arkham for Xbox One versus PS4, and they're arguably exogenous in the sense that their characteristics wouldn't be different since it's the exact same game title, but we also do a series of robustness checks to make sure that that's actually true. Okay, as you can see, this estimation hinges on a variety of assumptions. So through our robustness checks, we try to check for possibilities that these assumptions are worrisome or not. And so the first and the major concern can be selection. What if backward compatibility was launched in a way that we couldn't really compare backward compatible with non-backward compatible games? And so we do find some institutional evidence that this decision wasn't fully controlled by Microsoft by looking at different game characteristics. They were games by different publishers, varying time periods, and so on. The second thing we do here is that we check that there was no pre-announcement of the specific game titles. So again, people couldn't have preempted which games were going to be made backward compatible. And we also don't see any evidence of them acting in any kind of dynamic, forward-looking way. Finally, we compared games across their past sales trends as well as characteristics. And we look for alternative control groups, such as games that were made backward compatible much later in the second wave of compatibility. And then we do a comparison for those groups because arguably they would be more similar to the ones that were launched in the first round. And finally, in addition to our diff and diff estimation, we also look for synthetic controls for every single game unit, which helps us find a much cleaner counterfactual for each game. Another big concern with our estimates could be that there could be potential spillovers to the control group. So for our estimates to have any kind of causal interpretation and not simply be thought of as descriptive, which we're saying we don't want any treatment spillovers to affect the control units. And when can that happen? So imagine a scenario if there are two action games and then people saw them as substitutes. One is backward compatible, one is not. If somehow making one backward compatible affected the sales of the other, then we would see that there's a violation of the stable unit treatment value assumption, and we would be worried that these estimates are not really causal. And so generally, what helps us is in this institutional setting, typically games are not considered to be substitutes. So somebody who loves Call of Duty isn't just going to get any other first-person shooter. So we also can verify from the data what is the overlap between people who own both categories of games. So we do check in our individual level data that if there are people who own backward compatible PGC games, how many of them also have a non-backward compatible game? And we find this number is around 20% of our sample. And when we take them out of our regressions and re-estimate our models, we see pretty similar results. Again, this doesn't mean there are no other potential confounds, and only under these assumptions could there be a causal interpretation. For the NGC games, one other check we do is, are people using both Xbox and PlayStation consoles? If there is any evidence of such multi-homing, then we may expect some spillovers in that situation. However, we find that less than 3% of our sample actually owns both consoles. And so we're less so worried. And even if we take that 3% sample out of our individual estimation, we do find consistent effects. So those are some checks that are reported in much more detail in the paper. I'm happy to talk about any of them in more detail as needed as well. So I'm going to pause here for questions and see, I see 4 comments in the chat. I wonder if I've missed anything. Okay, perfect. If there are no questions, I'll move.
Sorry, yeah, just one quick question. So when it was announced and then all the games were immediately available, or my understanding was that like it was announced and that they were rolled out over time?
You know, it was
afterwards.
announced. So there are 2 things. In June of 2015, Microsoft had announced that they would be backward compatibility coming up soon, they didn't announce what dates, what games. And then the first time it was actually rolled out when the games actually were compatible was the event we're studying in November.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Okay. So here I'm showing you the parallel trends for pre-period sales for both the PGC games, which we're comparing the non-backward compatible and backward compatible games. And they look fairly similar in terms of their unit sales. We also compare in the graph at the bottom. In red, I'm showing you the games for Xbox One, which is the NGC, and comparing it with PS4 games. Again, remember, this is the exact same game title, and we don't see any differences. So with this, we can now start seeing some outcomes. How do the outcomes change before and after backward compatibility? So if you look at the graph on top, I'm showing you the unit sales change for games that were backward compatible pre and post, and those that were not. So in the red bars, you can see before backward compatibility, the backward compatible games were selling about 5,000 units per month, and that drops to almost half, whereas we see a much less absolute change in drop in sales for the non-backward compatible games, which means actually unit sales seems to be dropping much more for those games that were PGC and compatible. On the other hand, if you look at their prices, actually there's a less of a absolute fall, and these are significant differences. We don't see that much of a price decrease in compatible games. I'm going to show you similar model-free evidence for new generation games where we're comparing Xbox One and PS4 games. Here, the trends are actually pretty different. Unit sales increase much more for Xbox One games, almost becoming 4 times in the top chart. And then you see that that increase is not that big for PS4 games, which have the exact same title. At the bottom, I'm showing you their price. And the change in price pre and post compatibility looks very similar. So it seems like maybe there's not much of an effect going on for their prices. So we're going to show you the estimation results from our regressions now and see what are the key results we find over there. And so the first result I'm going to show you will be about PGC games and trying to explain the mechanisms for PGC games. And then after that, we'll get into NGC games. So for the PGC games, our main diff and diff model shows an increase in revenue for the backward compatible games in the 30 months after backward compatibility was launched. And we see this $15,000 effect, which is about 52% more revenues compared to the pre-period baseline sales. And one of the reasons we thought this might be happening is maybe it's just selling in more quantity. But counterintuitively, we actually saw a decrease in their unit sales for the compatible PGC games. Instead, we actually saw that there was higher retail price for these games after compatibility. So it seems like the unit sales actually fall, and this revenue effect seems to come more from less of a drop in their relative prices. So that's one of our key results. And we tried to explain why this is happening by looking at different kinds of games. So for instance, perhaps this is an effect for higher selling games, which are really popular. Like Tomo was saying, maybe there's some nostalgia around those games. And so we split our sample by high and low selling games. On the left panel, you see a huge revenue impact for higher selling games of about $54,000. And we don't see this kind of a significant effect on low selling games. So much of the PGC game sales are coming from the high selling games that were already doing pretty well in the pre-backward compatibility period in terms of a median split in revenues. And what's also interesting is price does go up for both kinds of games. In the sense, retailers are able to charge more after compatibility. However, we see that the unit sales drop is actually much more predominant for the low selling games. So we were very curious about the individual level game effects, because it seems like this is an industry where blockbuster games, some games become a hit and some don't. So we use the two-step synthetic control method proposed by Kathy and Venki, and she presented this paper actually last year in this seminar. So we draw from these methods to really create a clean counterfactual group for every single game in our data set. And sometimes synthetic controls are hard to construct because of the assumptions. So for instance, we would have the zero intercept, or all the weights on the control unit need to sum to 1 assumptions, but this method lets us test and relax some of those assumptions. So what you're seeing here is in the black dotted lines, the actual sales for the focal game, which I'm showing you Pirates of the Caribbean here. And in the blue solid line, I'm showing you the counterfactual we're able to create using the two-step synthetic control. And in the pre-period before the vertical blue line, their sales are trending very similarly. But in the post-period, we see actual sales much higher compared to the counterfactual. So we repeat this exercise for many, many games, and we see very similar patterns across them. And so we try to figure out what is driving this effect. Why are some games benefiting more in terms of the revenue after compatibility? And so I'm just showing you a quick snapshot of some example games here. We do find that most of this revenue lift is indeed coming from higher selling games, as was also obvious from our regression earlier. So it seems like more of the high selling games are selling in higher revenues after compatibility.
Sorry to have so many questions. I find the context really interesting. Do you think there's an effect based on, whether, like, my understanding was that there was different forms of, not to get too into the details here, but there are different forms of backwards compatibility, that some, you could use the disc, but some you had to download it specifically from the Xbox Live Arcade. And I'm wondering if the lower selling ones were typically arcade only, like, Plants vs. Zombies or something like that. That there's a few others I see on the list here, like, Prince of Persia maybe, which would have been more, I think, available specifically through a different channel. So I was thinking that could explain some of the differences here.
So I think it depends on what format the user owns the game in. So if I have Star Wars downloaded from Xbox Live directly, only in a digital format, versus if I have Star Wars in a physical disc format, they would both be compatible, but the way it would work is for the disc, I have to insert the disc and make sure it's in there while I'm playing, whereas for the digital version, I just have to do a digital download once and update my hardware. So I don't think it would be more of a which format they're using, but it shouldn't make a difference to us as researchers, because in both formats, compatibility would still work. I'm not sure if that's what you were asking.
I think my question is whether, like, for some games, to get the backwards compatibility, they can't buy from your retailer. They have to specifically go to the arcade. But I might be wrong about that.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. So the reason that's not the case is because the retailer is also selling digital games. So you could buy a digital license for the game through the retailer. So the only concern would be for people whose purchase we just don't see in our sample for retail. But other than that, the retailer is selling both of those. So the consumers can get both the physical and the digital game through the same retailer.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Good question. Perfect. Okay. So this to me was
maybe very quickly, just wanted to make sure I understand the effect you showed on quantity and revenue and price. This is based on all the periods after this announcement, right? All the periods after they said it's backward compatible.
Yes.
Did you when was it like, so price increased and quantity did it all happen at the same time? And it's like, it's basically based. I wonder if you just try to break this down over time, because I wonder, is it changes in revenue, which we saw on the synthetic control pictures, they're driven by a higher price that company decides to charge right away? Is it because there is just more people, so breaking it down in some way, because companies obviously are doing something at the same time as they announce this backward compatible, as their game becomes backward compatible. And I'm just trying to understand what are they doing and how much is driven by extra quantity sold, different prices, different competition, like what's going on?
That's a great question. Now we're going to test my slide jumping skills. So I'm going to have to jump to slide 76. Let's see what I can do. And we're going to show those dynamic effects over time, and more details are in the paper. But since you asked, and I do want to show that when we plot effects over time, so the revenue effects are strongest between months, say 3 and 15, and then they start to taper off. So we don't see that revenue effect being very long lasting. But I do the same thing for price and quantity. And actually the price increase is consistent throughout. So we continue to see that price is a little bit higher throughout the 30 months post compatibility. But for revenues, we do see that after a while, they just taper off. But it's still a pretty long lasting effect if you think about it, for almost a year after, more than a year after compatibility is launched. So those are some interesting patterns. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to me this sounds like, well, this looks like a very persistent effect. I wouldn't see from this picture it's more noisy, but I wouldn't interpret it as like really tapering off, right? So it seems like it's something like very uniform have changed at that point when it's introduced.
Right, that makes sense. Okay.
I have a quick question too. How often do you observe people purchasing like is a very similar game for the new console? Because for the new console, there isn't the old version of the game. Like I know some games are versioned, like sports games are versioned every single year.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to figure out, like, maybe some people have already purchased a very similar game for the new console, and so they're not as interested in the backward compatibility.
That is super interesting. So I haven't looked at the data on exactly which games they have for the new console and how that impacts anything they may or may not buy from the backward compatibility set. But yeah, that's something we can definitely explore. My intuition will be that even though some games sound similar or they have sequel versions, a lot of the gamers like to play the previous prequels before they get to the sequel. So we may still see some interest. And even, even if they've, say, played Fallout 3, they may still want to go back and play the original. But that's something we can easily verify from the data, and I'm going to look into that. Okay, perfect. So one result.
I just wanted to flag there is one question in the Q&A related to our previous discussion. This is the question about whether the increase in revenues is coming from new users versus older customers. I think new users adopting the game versus people not living the game, or like, yeah.
Yeah, so this is super interesting. And I did a bunch of raw plots. And what we're seeing is these are not actually coming from new users. Much of this increase in revenue for the PGC is actually coming from the price increase. We don't see much, we actually see overall quantity declining. And even new users don't seem to buy more of these PGC games. But that's an explanation we find more evidence for in the NGC setting. We see a lot more adoption of the new generation console, which is why a lot of new users start buying the NGC games. But that we tested for it and we didn't find much evidence to support that in this PGC setting, if that makes sense.
Got it, yeah, thank you.
That was a great point. So one of the things we do still haven't explained really is why is there this unit sales drop? So using our individual level data, we started hunting for some explanations. Why are people buying less of these games? And we found that the biggest group that's contributing to lower sales in terms of unit sales for PGC games is actually the pre-owners. They already have these games, and particularly if they don't plan to upgrade, they don't find a reason to buy more of these games compared to the non-backward compatible games, which again, remember, is a broader set and choices to choose from. So that's one result which can explain potentially the unit sales drop. Okay, so what have I shown you so far? I've shown you how the sales of PGC games change after the introduction of backward compatibility, particularly if you find that the revenues for the PGC compatible games go up relative to non-compatible games. And this seems more of a price increase effect from what retailers are able to charge. We don't find any evidence for quantity increases. In fact, quantity drops, particularly due to pre-owners, and the revenue increases seems to come more from the high-selling games. The next question we wanted to explore was what happens to the sales of NGC games after backward compatibility? And this is where we find a similar revenue lift, in fact, much higher in percentage term. This is close to a 90% increase in revenues between the pre and the post backward compatibility period. And where is this effect coming from? We don't see much of a change in price. It's actually non-significant, but the quantity sales go up significantly after backward compatibility for the new generation console games. Now, the reason this is interesting is because new generation console games themselves didn't go through a compatibility change. They were compatible with the new console all along. So what we try to see is it creating access to a new market in terms of more people upgrading who then buy these games. So we try to see our pre-owners of backward compatible games. So these are people who owned games like Borderlands that became available for the new console. Do these people upgrade more? And indeed, we find, yes, their upgrade likelihood to get the new console in the post-backward compatibility period is much higher. And we don't see them switching to a competing console as much. However, in some results in the paper that we're now updating, we do find the switching to PS4 is actually significantly much less for some of the subsample of people who are not multi-homers. But that's a more subtle result that I'll get into later if there are any questions. We also then want to see if these upgraders will end up buying more of the NGC games, because that's what we're eventually interested in. Are the game sales going to change? And we find that if people upgrade, remember, these are people who own the new console by upgrading from the older console. These are not first-time owners of the new console. So relative to the first-time new owners, they're buying much more of the new console games. And that's why we see both unit purchase and spending increasing from them significantly more after the launch of backward compatibility. Now, why would we ever expect this to not happen? You might wonder, this is more intuitive. However, they always have a choice now to just buy the PGC games that are compatible instead of buying more of the newer games. And we don't see that effect as much in play. And in the paper, we discuss some of the additional findings related to the budget and how they allocate their budgets between different games. So those are some of the main results explaining why we find an effect for NGC games. Are there any questions about these results so far?
Nati, I have a clarification question. So I was just reading your data description section, and you're using this sample of purchase histories for Xbox owners. Must they have owned at least one Xbox before the event of the backwards compatibility? Like, how is selection into the sample determined? I know you randomly sampled from some users, but how is the sample of initial users chosen?
So they could have bought any Xbox product from any generation, and that's a subsample we sample randomly from. So they don't necessarily have had to own Xbox 360 in particular. They could have had the original Xbox, for example, or they could have had maybe a controller. But as long as they have one Xbox purchase, we would have them in our sample.
I guess I'm a little bit concerned that you might be sampling on the outcome if their first kind of interaction with Xbox products came after the backward compatibility assumption.
Can you say that again?
So this is not a random sample of people, it is a random sample of people conditional on them purchasing an Xbox product. Now, some of those people have interacted with the Xbox product only after the announcement of backward compatibility. Is that correct? Because it seems
So,
like
just to clarify, these are people who would have purchased an Xbox product before compatibility. So they're not new to Xbox after compatibility. So we're not sampling on a post-treatment variable, in other words, just to be on the same page.
Okay, yeah, because it wasn't clear from the description.
Got it. So in the past, they should have at least bought one Xbox product.
Okay, thank you.
I see your concern. Like, what if they're using Xbox products for the first time after compatibility, then they have no baseline or benchmark. But those are not the people here. These are people who've had an Xbox product, which could be of any generation. Again, if we only sampled those who were using Xbox 360 before, that could also be some kind of selection issues, because then they probably have a bigger ownership of PGC games already. So this could be any generation of Xbox. And the reason we really have to do that is because otherwise, in a sample of gamers, if you see maybe 60% people don't even have an Xbox, we're not going to find anything of interest to speak to our mechanisms. And that's the only reason we have to have at least some criteria where they had some affiliation with Xbox in the past.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And just a one more question. Like, so you presented us some results so far. Are you gonna talk about like the economic reasons for why this is going on? Like at some point, or is there like kind of no underlying economic model, and we should be thinking about just this is a pure kind of reduced form exercise of what happens?
That's a great question. So this paper started off in an empirical IO class. So originally our idea was to think of a structural model trying to explain all the factors that go into a consumer's utility of software and console games. But now we moved away from that approach. Actually, I'm focusing on this more as a reduced form exercise for multiple reasons. The first is our data set is primarily Xbox related, and we don't see all the competing products and consoles. We don't have complete idea of what the competitive landscape looks like. So we can't really cleanly model how people are choosing between, say, Xbox and PS4. The second reason we wanted to capture mainly what happens with this backward compatibility construct in terms of game level variation. And even though the structural model could buy us a counterfactual world where we could, say, remove backward compatibility completely, we are more interested in the reduced form estimates of what is this heterogeneity like, what kind of games would have more versus less revenue changes or sales changes as a result of the compatibility decision. And then finally, I think that we didn't also see any dynamics in our model, in our data setting. So we plotted all kinds of consumer upgrade decisions, and closer to backward compatibility, we didn't see any evidence of people being more forward-looking or holding off on their upgrade or purchase. And maybe this goes back to the reason that people couldn't preempt compatibility decisions because there was no pre-announcement of what games would be made compatible. So those were some of the factors we did consider. I'm pretty open to a structural model if the research question forces us in that direction, but so far I think our reviewers have been pushing us more to do a descriptive paper with more number of categories, more number of time periods. So we are taking that approach right now, but I would welcome any suggestions.
Yeah, I wasn't actually suggesting a structural model. I guess I was just curious, like economically, why the prices went up, for example. Like you said, the price went up, and it would be useful to have something more than simply just the statement that prices went up.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, I think we can look more into that, particularly from a retailer perspective, because why are they able to charge more prices? Is it that they're discounting these games less? Is it for used versus new games? So we would definitely look more into the underlying reason for those price changes. Venki, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, can you hear me? Yeah, I think, let me clarify, Andre, what we find is relative price is higher for the backward compatible games than for non-compatible. As an industry trend, the prices always come down. It's just that they are able to hold up. And the economic argument is that, you go back to a consumer utility, your utility is higher for if some games are made backward compatible. So there could be an anticipation on the part of consumers that if the company is making some games backward compatible, then I could be better off owning more of this company's products, this platform's products, because in future, I might get more utility out of more backward compatible games. So that's also a possible explanation. But as Unnati said, we try to put so many things in the paper, and I don't think we got a response. We got more of a response, take it out. Thank you.
Thanks for adding that.
Maybe not to explain too much time on it, but maybe like related to this point, one thing without going full like trying to estimate individual level choice model or dynamics, or I feel like it will be helpful if you could, if there was some shifters of price before and after, which allows you to estimate demand for these games before and after, and then think about a very simple model of like, say, treat these guys as monopolists. They set price using inverse markup rule, and then see what is it about demand which allows them to charge higher prices. Like, do we actually see that people become less elastic after? Was that full rationalized? So just giving us, even like descriptively explaining what changed on the competition side, I think that will like, I understand like there might be not enough instruments for prices, so you need like to separate out in some way. But I think that will help us to understand so what drives this price increase, why did firms decide to do it. And quickly related, there was a question in the Q&A about to clarify on how the prices of games are decided. Is it the retailer deciding this, or is it the game, or like who is deciding? And I think that fits nicely to the discussion as well. So wanted to bring it up now.
Right. I think that suggestion is very valuable, and these prices are all retail prices. That's what we observe at which we are seeing people buy these games. So all the prices in our data are retail prices, but we could certainly look more into what is it about these prices and how is it translating into some of the effects we see for quantity or revenues. And that's something we can do from our data. And even, there are papers like, Avery's paper, JP has a paper which have looked at these kinds of phenomena in a more structural setting too. We may be able to do something in terms of just showing descriptively, are there, for example, consumers who are more or less price elastic, and does backward compatibility change anything for them? So those are definitely some really good comments. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I wanted to add to what you just said is that, the really exciting thing about this data set that makes this paper cool is one of the things that makes this paper cool, is that you have individual panel data for console sales that's not selected on things like, achievements or other things. Most of it for this generation stuff is usually tied to achievements. So exploring that individual heterogeneity, which you can do and many others can't do, I think would be a really cool way to get at these forces.
That's a great point. And honestly, I think most of the video game papers have used NPD data, which isn't as granular in some sense. So we are able to extract some more granular insights about individual consumers. And that's kind of our hope with the whole heterogeneity analysis, but maybe there's a way to do that even more and tie it to some economic reasoning for why that's happening for different consumer segments. Because it's very hard in this setting, as you know, to make any generic statements about either games or consumers, since there is so much heterogeneity at play. So we appreciate that. Okay, just to summarize my results on the second research question, we wanted to see what happens to sales of new generation consoles and console games. And here we find, again, there's a huge revenue lift of almost 90%. We don't see any change in prices. In fact, PS4 and Xbox One prices seem to be trending exactly similarly for the same titles. We do see that pre-owners of backward compatible games tend to upgrade much more in this setting. And when they upgrade to the new console in the post period, we see them buying more of the new generation console games instead of just continuing to purchase the backward compatible PGC games. So those are some of the key results we have so far. Our third question was about the mechanisms, and those game and heterogeneity related mechanisms are at play. So I'm going to summarize and then leave maybe 2 or 3 minutes for questions. We had 3 research questions going in. How do sales of PGC games change on the introduction of backward compatibility? We found that their revenues go up, but this is more because of a price effect. In case of NGC games, we again find a revenue increase due to compatibility. However, we don't find much of a price change in this setting, and it's more of a quantity effect. And I even looked at some raw plots on number of people buying NGC games, and there's definitely a much bigger increase. So there is some attraction of new markets after backward compatibility for these games. We also find some evidence for game and gamer-related heterogeneity playing a role in explaining the mechanisms, for instance, based on high versus low selling games, and also whether these gamers are pre-owners of the old backward compatible games versus whether they are also upgrading to the new console. So those are some key results. And I personally find this a really intriguing setting where new standards are constantly emerging. And for managers, this could be a useful study that shows value of offering this kind of a selective compatibility, particularly if you think about what implications these can have. You can see both PGC and NGC software sales being impacted in some sense once compatibility is rolled out. And there is a little bit of caveat here that potentially it could hamper the sales of the previous generation console game sales. So that's something managers may want to keep into account depending on their objectives for various games and overall for the new versus old console. And finally, we see that effects do vary by game. high selling PGCs benefit more. And this is an industry where there's a long tail and products start to taper off in terms of the sales over time. So maybe there's some interesting research opportunity for what is a great timing or what is a good time of launching compatibility. We also find buyer level heterogeneity in terms of pre-owners tending to upgrade and buy more NGCs. And so firms can adopt targeted approaches to potentially reach out to these consumers more than others and test their efficacies in various ways. So I'm going to pause here for any questions. I see one in the Q&A, but if there are other comments, we're still in the process of revising this paper, and we'll update the new version on SSRN shortly. Please email either me or Venki any of your comments. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the panelists as well.
I really enjoyed it. One additional thought I just had was that, I think the great thing about this data is you've got the individual aspect. I would think it would be perfect if you could combine this with the NPD data or some similar data set to try to get at, so you don't have to think about this retailer substitution stuff. Like, I understand you can do digital downloads, but I feel like through this retailer, but I feel like there's an additional step. Whereas it becomes much more convenient to just buy it from the Xbox Live Arcade at that point. So there may be some substitution. I think if you could just rule that out by looking at things like NPD or some other similar-ish aggregate data set, and then use your panel data to get into mechanisms. I think that would be
great. We have reached out to NPD in the past. We haven't had much luck for this generation of consoles, but maybe that's an opportunity we can explore again. We would also be interested if anybody has leads in Xbox Network or Xbox Live. I know there's a lot of cool gameplay data also. We can actually see what people are doing with these compatible games when they actually reinstall them or install them after compatibility. Is any change there? One of the things we're trying to do with the Twitter data is capture more of the consumer sentiment more broadly. But that data is definitely a little bit more difficult to find some clean patterns. It's very noisy. So we would welcome if anybody has any leads or opportunities to partner.
Just to extend Vinati's point, when we had conversations with both the retailer and some contacts in Microsoft, what we found was that they coordinate that. Even if somebody could go to Microsoft's site and download, the retailer would be aware of who did it from there. The retailer has a loyalty program, so they know exactly who did what. So there's an amount of communication and transparency. So it will show up in our data if the retailer if the consumer went to directly download it. So at least we are a little bit comforted by that fact. But apart from that, you're absolutely right. If you could get our hand on NPD kind of data that cuts across multiple retailers, and then it'll have a 360-degree view of all the brands, it'll be ideal.
Yes, and also
that's at 360. That's an Xbox pun. I like
it. So far, we've been trying not to be pun intended, but it's. Yeah.
We also would love some more categories. I know that we're looking at Nintendo's controller level compatibility, because for Xbox, all the controllers, they're either compatible or not. It's not very different in that setting. But for Nintendo, we found some variation with hardware, just to be able to generalize it beyond games. And there is a cool paper, which I'm going to recommend. It's a job market candidate at Tilburg. She has done some work on mobile, backward compatibility in mobile technologies, on how CDMA versus GSM became, it was harder for GSM providers to become compatible when standards moved from second generation to third generation 3G. So that's another cool paper and setting in which these kinds of results could generalize potentially.
I have another question, and maybe I missed this, but do you have any information on the income of the people in the panel, or at least demographic proxies for income? Because one thing that I'm thinking about is that people that own the new generation console are probably much wealthier than the ones that own the old one, and so now that they can potentially demand some of these backwards compatible games, maybe the elasticity maybe the demand is less elastic as a result. So I think that could be an interesting thing to maybe explore.
I see what you mean, and they may be willing to pay more for that feature also in some sense. Yeah, we don't have any income data directly. We have looked at monthly spending across different categories of this retailer for each consumer, and we could maybe proxy, but that wouldn't be a perfect proxy.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is that nowadays retailers are trying to not give us data on a lot of these income and other things so as to keep their.
They have actually
data
stopped
confidential.
collecting some of it too because of all the privacy regulations. I think a lot of the retailers, at some point in our data, we don't see a lot of the demographics. So,
but your point about proxies are well taken. We could try and look at some proxies. And to your hypothesis that the present generation might be less price elastic, it could cut both ways because also we know that a lot of games are being played more digitally over the years than in the console. So there could be an argument that a lot of younger game players, even though they could afford, they could actually end up wanting to pay less because they have more digital download alternatives. So that's an empirical question too.
right, and the average gamer age is now 34, 35, mid 30s. So I would imagine they're hopefully decently earning.
I think that's just maybe, if I understand Andre's question correctly, it's still trying to rationalize this increase in price, which one explanation could be, actually it could be a good story where we take old games and we introduce them for a new console, and now our demand is coming from people who used to play this game 15 years ago as kids, and now they're like 30, 35, 40 years old, and now they have high income, and hence they're willing to pay a lot. In terms of proxies, I don't know how the proxy is. If you observe, let's say, like zip code or like some area people live, that could be a proxy for income. So even if that's individual level data, but like roughly like some location where they live, that could be one idea.
Very good suggestion. Yeah.
That's a great point.
Sorry, maybe I missed this, but is there, and maybe this is too old school, but is there a role for second-hand markets in this stuff, or is it a thing of the past and that doesn't exist anymore?
So our sales are both used and new, but I'm not sure. We're not able to identify.
I think the role of used is much smaller. It's shrinking so much that bulk of the sales is new. So
yeah,
you can take 90% of the sales is all new.
And like Venki said, a lot of it now is digital. In our data period, when we started collecting all this information, it was maybe 30 million people were using Xbox Live. Now it's like close to 100 million are using Xbox Live, and the Xbox Network, they've renamed it. So I think digital games are now much more the norm.
There used to be a big value for trading in games before in the past, but that is completely become a thing. And I don't know if you're following now, the chip shortage, Avery probably knows all about it. The chip shortage, the prices are going up. So ours is probably a precursor to what is happening now, but for a completely different reason. Now people are, willing to pay. I'll tell you, my son was willing to pay double the price for everything.
You mean for consoles, right?
Everything, games, everything, because the demand has gone up everywhere. I mean, the price effect has got an indirect effect on everything.
There is also a shortage of like distribution of games. Is that because I would expect it? I know this logic like for like cars and like Tesla. Like if you order like a new Tesla now, the secondary market is like more expensive because you need to wait for a year for a new Tesla.
Right.
I can see this logic for consoles, and I'm just surprised it also applies to games. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, everybody wants to cash in, right?
Yeah.
So it's surprising how much of this price inflation has affected everything. The other day I was changing oil. The oil change has almost doubled in many of the places. So I asked how this is explainable. He says that the oil filter itself has changed from $1.70 to $2.70. But the rest is all everybody's piling on. So everywhere people are marking up, whether it's related or not. And so this is an opportunity everybody's not
Tesla
wanting to.
stock is down by $40 today.
Yeah, that's because Elon is selling his stock.
Yeah.
He may buy it back. He may be selling it to buy it back. So maybe Avery, you know something that is here. It looks like you've played this in and out.
No, I just keep people make the assumption. I don't have time for that. I'm trying to keep up with all this stuff. I don't own an Xbox. I've never owned an Xbox.
Well, maybe you're a PS4 guy.
I don't own a PlayStation. Never owned a PlayStation.
PS5, okay.
What about cameras? I know Yufeng is now getting into more cameras and lenses. He has a nice new paper.